Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jack Layton Chair sponsored community organizing against anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism amid the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm very excited for this morning's presentation. First of all, I'm going to just thank a number of co-sponsors, the Department of Sociology at Ryerson University, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University, the Unifor National Chair in Social Justice and Democracy at Ryerson, and there's also two student groups from Ryerson who also supported us in this event. The Continuing Education Student Association of Ryerson and the Ryerson Liberal Arts Society. I will introduce Keke Roach, the Unifor chair, who has kindly agreed to do the land acknowledgement for today's event.
Thank you very much, Ken. Many of us in this online event are situated in Takaronto, Toronto, on the lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation in the Dish with One Spoon territory, where we are thankful to live and work. We're inspired by their ongoing struggles against colonialism, and we must act in solidarity with those struggles. We're also able to come together through the use of Zoom, which has erected its headquarters in San Jose, California, on the traditional territory of the Muwekma Ohlone people. And so we're collectively also indebted to the Muwekma Ohlone Nation. So as we turn now to reflect on organizing against anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism, I also want to remember the labor and sacrifice of those who came before us, who came in chains, who fled persecution, who came escaping war and abject poverty, and whose struggles against racism we've all benefited from. So thank you to Ken and all of the other co-sponsors and organizers and everyone helping us to bring you this forum today.
Thank you. I want to also give thanks to two key participants, Keegan Hobson, who is a placement student with the Layton Chair, and Aletta Fricker, the administrator to the chair. They're working in the background today, moderating chat and keeping us going technically, and also helped me a great deal in organizing the event. A little bit about the Layton Chair. The Jack Layton Chair seeks to advance Jack's legacy of humanitarian leadership by promoting progressive social change and strengthening political capacity at Ryerson University. Jack Layton taught in the Ryerson University Politics Department and was the leader of the opposition as the head of the New Democratic Party. The chair aims to help students explore their sense of engagement around social justice issues with a focus on social democracy and student engagement. It's a space where students, along with community members, can meet, try out their passions for social justice, and experiment, risk multiple modes of personal and political expression. The chair is involved in a number of multidisciplinary projects with a focus on cultural studies, pedagogy, social relations, and a variety of other disciplines. So an outline of the event today, we will have two presentations, and I will introduce both Olivia and Xiaobei just prior to the presentation. We're grateful to have both agree, Olivia Chow and Xiaobei Chen. Each talk will be about a half an hour, and then we'll be open to the chat and Q&A after the talks. I just want to make a bit, you don't get to see the audience, and we're not clear exactly who all the audience is, but we were able to tell a bit from Eventbrite the interest in this event, and I'm excited to share some of that. We didn't really ask you to self-identify, but there are ways we can kind of tell who's present. We know there's participants from Simon Fraser University, of course, many Ryerson participants, Carleton, as well as the University of Toronto. There's several registrants from the Ottawa Chinese Community Service Center, and there's also several postgraduate Manchester University students, which makes it a truly international event. We welcome you all, but of course we welcome everybody who's here, whether we know your affiliation or not. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Olivia Chow. Olivia. Olivia is the founder and director of the Institute for Change Leaders. Since March 2000, there's Olivia. Hi, Olivia. She is the founder and director of the Institute for Change Leaders. She has a certificate from the Marshall Gans Leadership School at Harvard's Kennedy's School Executive Program, has taught over 6,000 people across Ontario. She's empowered many women through teaching at George Brown College and also at Ryerson University. She's held elective offices for 30 years as a school trustee, a city councillor, and a member of parliament. Olivia has been a tremendous support to the Jack Layton Chair, and she tirelessly champions for universal early childhood education, national public transit strategy, and fair immigration policies. Thank you for joining us this morning, Olivia.
Thank you, Ken, for putting this together and bringing all of us together. It's wonderful to be able to connect with you again, with the Jack Layton team. I would love to be able to see you sometime face to face, hopefully soon. I'm just going to start by sharing screen, let me just start. In about 2014, a few years ago, I made a decision to run for office, and the first thing I encountered, you know, of course, the typical running for office, and there's always rewarding experience, and also you get to see a huge number of folks all across Toronto. But at that time, perhaps because there were a lot of focus on the mayoralty race, I received a huge number of really negative racist and sexist comments in my Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram account. And my wonderful team tried to protect me and not let me see that. But what happened was that when I went to these all candidates meeting, here is what I saw, what I heard a lot was someone actually publicly said, "Go back to China." And it was hurtful. And I did, of course, call the person out and just ranted and try to say that, you know, I'm a Canadian and I have represented Canadians for a long, long time. And to top things off, speaking about racism, to top things off, this is what I saw next. This is the night before the election day. I believe the election was in October or something like that. So the day before, in Toronto Sun, I don't know whether I had glasses at that time. That was supposed to be me wearing a Mao suit and with slanted eyes and stepping on the coattail of Jack Layton, my late husband, the former leader of the NDP. And I thought, my God, this is 2014. What the heck is going on? And of course, we do know in Canada, there's a long history of systemic racism and racism towards whether it is colonialism against the indigenous people, they were here long before us, and to success a number of racial minority groups. And so what I'm going to do today is to spend a bit of time talking about the history of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism, and then talk a bit about how it connects to today. But given that this is COVID time and too much of despair and anger is not good for our psyche, I'm going to cast it in a way of a winning campaign, how the people at the time was able to overcome racism and got some form of justice, not completely, but a bit of it, okay? So it's going to be a hopeful lecture, not one that's going to be a complete downer, like the screen that is in front of you. So at the turn of the century, the government of Canada wanted to bring different parts of the provinces, and it is a big country, to bring all of the different provinces, territories together. And they thought the best way to do it is build a railroad. And of course, building railroad is hard, it's difficult, and they didn't want to pay a whole lot. So they thought, cheap labor. Where can we find cheap labor to build the railroad? Of course, at the time, they went to China and brought a lot of cheap labor. So here are the Chinese folks that are building the railroad, CPR, and they worked hard. The situation was difficult. A lot of people died at the time because of dynamites and overexhaustion or winter, cold and injuries, etc. So it's really blood, sweat, and tears in building this railroad. And thank God they were able to finally got it done, together with many others, not just Chinese, however. So those wonderful Chinese Canadians helped bring the country together by building this railroad. And so what did they get for thanking them, other than their, some of them sacrificing their lives? Was not a whole lot. There were terrible racist comments and say yellow hordes, they're horrible people, get them out of the country. We don't want them. And before you know, these brave souls had to pay in head tax to come to Canada. Now, of course, it was the men that came to Canada, and they left their wives and their children behind. And some of them went back to visit their families. And in order to come back to Canada, they had to pay a Chinese head tax. It's only for Chinese at the time. And it went from $50 to $500. And that's a substantial amount of money. It's about, say, 10 or 20 years ago, figures is about $2 million. You can certainly buy several houses for that dollar amount. And then it was difficult. So they went through a period where there were a lot of loneliness because the men were separated from their family. they are all alone in Canada. And interesting enough, it was the Indigenous people at the time that helped some of these folks to adapt to Canada, adapt to the harsh winter, to be connected with them. And there were families that were that came together because, you know, both of the groups are really systemically discriminated. So what happened? Things got worse. By 1923 to 1947, the government of Canada said no Chinese can come into Canada because we just don't want them. And it was also that period that a lot of Japanese Canadian were interned, their homes were taken away. They were all rounded up and pushed to another place and lost their livelihood, lost their fish farms, lost their land, etc., lost their family. It was just lost their homes. It took a long time for the government of Canada this is an American thing, no Chinese. And what you are seeing is finally Stephen Harper, after the Prime Minister in 2006, finally apologized. It was a 23 years campaign, and that finally got the government of Canada to say, what we did was, the policy was racist, and this is the redress to in this case, it was James Pond, who was holding the last spike. That is the spike that just the last one that went in to build the railroad. And so there was a ceremony in Canada, the House of Commons. Why do I give that history? Is because this 23 years campaign, and I was very much part of it, would not have been successful had it not been a group called Chinese Canadian National Council. But where did Chinese Canadian National Council came from? Where, like, how did that get formed? And what is it doing now to combat anti-Asian racism? What occurred at the time was in about 1979. At the time, the Chinese community at the time was not that well organized. There was a show, and some of you that watch CTV would notice there's a show called W5. It's an investigative weekly show that's supposed to expose some truth about what's happening in our country. Their counterpart is CBC Fifth Estate. Okay, so CTV, national company, national TV, did a program called W5, and it's called Campus Giveaway. Campus Giveaway really was about how your son and daughter could not get into that university because all these foreigners are taking the seats, taking the university's spaces, and therefore your son and daughter can't get into university because of these foreigners. And what they show as foreigners were people with darker hair, different skin color, i.e. Asian. Asians are taking away your spots, your kids' spots. And that's why it's called Campus Giveaway. And of course, none of it was true because the Canadians that they show was in fact Canadians. They were Canadian born. the pharmacy department, for example, at the time university, it was a U of T campus. They weren't accepting foreign students in some of the faculties. So none of it was true, and it was bad research. And it caught these people on camera that were, quote, they were foreigners, they were Canadian born, they're Chinese Canadian. Just because they don't look white doesn't mean that they are foreigners, or, you know. So what happened was that this racist program immediately caught the attention of the students and a lot of community activists. And there emerged a group of Chinese Canadian that said, there is not a chance we're going to let this happen. That we want CTV to apologize, and not only apologize, but to do a program to state the truth and publicly apologize and have some kind of compensation. Now, initially, CTV go away, forget it. And within that, a few days after the W5 program was put together, there was a meeting at the Toronto Cecil Community Center in December 19th, 1979. I think in 1980, and that was the initial public meeting. Actually, it was September 30th, 1979 that the CTV program first started, campus giveaway. And there was about 200 people came, and there was a defamation lawsuit that was put together. And within less than 3 months, the organizing team with a core team decided on a double campaign. One is an air campaign, you know, to get all the media coming together, supporting them or broadcasting the problem. The other was a ground campaign, and they did a bit of a snowflake model. How did that happen? So they had a core team, and the core team then went out to bring people together. They put together 16 ad hoc committee all across Canada. So this is not a Toronto problem, because it is, CTV is a national program. And this Toronto team started by saying, no, we need, whether it is in Calgary or Thunder Bay or in Vancouver, Victoria, we need different committees. So there was ad hoc committee that was formed in 16 committees all across Canada, whether it's Halifax, Vancouver. They were led by young people, and some of them university students, some are late 20s, and they were fighting for equality and justice. So this was the core team, and supported by the Toronto ad hoc committee. And they mobilized a large number of people. They went and brought a lot of the politicians on board to say, you cannot allow this to happen. Now, remember, this is the time before you have YouTube, or they were using fax machine. And so there were demonstrations in front of the CTV. This is in front of the CTV headquarters. There were rallies. We Are Canadians also. W5 promotes racism, gets your figures right. And it was really quite effective. Oh, pardon me. And what happened was that because of the campaign was so relentless, that there was a happy ending, but not without even more racism. Toronto Sun, for example, after interviewing one of the core members, core member Chuck Wan, and Dr. Joseph Wong, who was, you know, some of the core team, Irene, etc., that wonderful team of people, said, this is just a bunch of communists, a bunch of communists. That was the the insult of the day, that you're a bunch of communists and therefore just ignore them. And it had anyway, it had a happy ending. CTV publicly apologized, and it worked out. But out of it, a group called Chinese Canadian National Council was formed on April 20th in 1980. I owned my own political involvement through the W5 movement. And I owned my political involvement to even before forming this Chinese Canadian National Council. In 1977, I started researching the history of Chinese in Canada and realized that, my gosh, this was what's happening, and I didn't learn it in high school. How come I didn't know the history of Chinese Canadian in Canada? I didn't know about the head tax. I didn't know about the Chinese Exclusionary Act. So, which is why when I, in the 80s, early 80s, I started on the campaign to bring justice to the Chinese head taxpayers. And, 23 years later, when I became a member of parliament, I was very, very glad that we were able to finally win the campaign and finally got justice to some of the Chinese head taxpayers. I bring all of this together to give you the context about what's happening today. We know that racism is alive and well, and we saw reports of, we saw folks being told that, this is, you're dirty, go back to China. And this is viewed by I hate to still call him the president. He's still the president of the United States, gone soon, but calling it a China virus, Kung Fu virus, Wuhan virus. Well, no, Wuhan is too difficult to understand. China virus, and how many times you heard this China virus? So that kind of racism was just horrific. It's coming from the top, and people are echoing it. So it's like bat soup, you're dirty, and make it sick, and etc., etc. And so what was happening is that there are a large number of racial harassment and incidents of assaults, and the racial category, people are feeling, in the Asian community, feeling the heat. There was, the responding, there have been quite a few polls done, and this one is Angus Reid, I believe. 50% reported being called names, insulted, a direct result of COVID outbreak. And 43% of them said that they've been threatened or intimidated. Additionally, 3 in 10, that's like 30%, report being frequently exposed to racist graffiti or messaging on social media since the pandemic began. And while just as many, 29%, said they're frequently made to feel as though they pose a threat to the health and safety of others. And it is, the need is, so what do we do? What is happening right now is that the Chinese Canadian National Council, you see here CCNC, has now kicked back for social justice. SJ, by the way, stand for social justice, are now coming back and saying that we have to stop the racism. And this is the Toronto ad together with CCNC saying anti-East Asian racism in faces like Go Back to China has no place in Toronto. I want to spend a few minutes to talk about that, because our next speaker will go deeper into this. But I also want to say that racism sometimes are not so visible. Yes, graffiti, verbal threats, physical assaults, those are visible. You can see them and you can feel them. But if you're looking at numbers, and let's use Toronto as an example, we are seeing the virus are affecting people that are earning $30,000 or less. You saw the report today. And people that are being infected are, by and large, a good percentage, a bigger percentage of them are BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And they are frontline workers. They work to take care of seniors. They work to take care of children. They sell us food and essential items. They are the ones that are being left behind. So there's also a stereotype that, again, is not correct to say, well, Asians, they by and large are doing well, they have some money, and they are, they're just fine. They're doing fine. No, they're not, because the restaurants that a lot of the Chinese Canadians worked in, the grocery stores are not doing well. The restaurants are mostly closed. They're doing takeouts, but they are unemployed and they are desperately poor. And a lot of them do not even know how to apply for the emergency benefits or the EI. They may not qualify for EI. So racism actually has a deeper level through lack of service, lack of public support, and lack of awareness. And then the economic discrimination is severe. And I know there are people that are in desperate situation because they're just the income is just not coming in. So I hope to spend some time later on to answer your questions, to explore what we can do together. It is very important that we come together. And I hope we can also stay in touch. You can find me at changeleaders@ryerson.ca. And what we do is we teach people to find their power that they have, so that people that are discriminated, or people that are being threatened, or people that are in bad economic shape can find the power within themselves and be trained to use their voice to advocate. And we need a next round of support for the Chinese Canadian National Council, so we could work together and say no to anti-Asian racism in all its forms, be it verbal, physical, graphic, or economic discrimination. So I'm looking forward to having a good discussion with all of you. Hope we can keep in touch through changeleaders@ryerson.ca. Thank you, Ken. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Olivia. And thanks for giving the longer unfortunate historical thread to anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism, but also the very positive community organizing that you are involved in. And so interesting to hear about your political, how you developed as a political person. Thanks for sharing that. Xiaobei, I'm about to introduce Xiaobei Chen, who I can see, and you'll see in a moment. Xiaobei is a professor of sociology and the associate chair in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. She's the president of the Canadian Sociological Association. Her current research and engagement are around anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism associated with COVID-19 pandemic. Her research and teaching interests include sociology of childhood and youth, governance and power, citizenship, racism, colonialism, the Chinese diaspora, and Buddhist social thought. Her latest book is a co-edited volume called The Sociology of Childhood and Youth in Canada. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Xiaobei. Welcome, Xiaobei.
Thank you so much, Ken, for your generous introduction and for having me here. It is really a great honor to be a speaker for today's event. So I just want to give my sincere thanks to the Jack Layton Chair and all the other co-sponsors for this event. I want to say hi to everybody as well. I can't see you. I wish I could see you, but I'm so happy that you make the time to attend this event. I want to start by offering some words to locate myself, because I think these are important aspects of my personality that matters to today's discussion. I grew up and was educated in mainland China. I worked there briefly until 1993. I then studied at the University of Hong Kong for 2 years, from 1993 to 94. Then I came to this colonized land to study social work and social policy at the University of Toronto in 95. I'm sure Ken would remember that. My current community engagement is mostly with Chinese Canadian community service organizations, especially Ottawa Chinese Community Service Center, as well as with the mainland Chinese diaspora. So I want to share some, I guess, observations from both my community work and also some of my research. I want to start by saying that we need to have an understanding of the big picture for the upsurge of anti-Chinese and Asian racism. Often when we think about anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism, we think about attacks that we've read about, heard about, seen on social media, or hear politicians condemn. But we need to understand that the big picture here is that we have a situation where blaming China has become a very convenient script for some politicians, pundits, journalists, and the public. This blaming China narrative disguises mistakes, and it's very convenient to use to shift the responsibility. It also gets clicks, right? That's something that we shouldn't forget. This narrative also sell ads and sell papers, sell books. All of this happened at the expense of Chinese or Chinese-looking people who are then attacked, intimidated, and distrusted. So what we are witnessing here, this shadow pandemic of racism, is it has this blaming China narrative. It has become accepted as common sense, as a go-to narrative. So that, Olivia earlier mentioned Trump and many other pundits as well use and promote inflammatory commentaries using terms such as the China virus, the Chinese virus, and the CCP virus. The CCP stands for the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese have become the scapegoat of our time, much like in history, blaming the Jews for causing the Black Death and for causing bad economic times and so on. I have 2 points to especially make here. One is that this blaming China is actually didn't just actually start with COVID-19. Indeed, anti-Chinese sentiments have been building in Canada for some time. For example, recent socio-economic problems in Vancouver have been simplistically attributed to Chinese Canadians, especially in the more recent immigrants from China. And historically, we were just reminded by Olivia that the Chinese laborers were blamed for having made the job scarce for white laborers as well. So We are living in a time of a geopolitical shift. With China's rise in economic significance, with the tension between China and the US escalating, with China's authoritarian regime and unitary governance structure and culture that's very different from ours, Chinese scapegoating has become an easy weapon for politicians and for some in the public to grab and to use to shift responsibilities from their backs to others. To most Canadians, China is an abstract idea. In everyday life, blame lands on actual bodies here. So there is, in this aspect, there is not much difference between saying China virus or Chinese being virus. Many would just equate China with anybody who looks East Asian. So this stigma is actually deeply rooted in the Canadian collective psyche, and it's going to be very hard to eliminate. Another point that I want to make is also that even though we point a finger at Trump, but blaming China, blaming the Chinese is a serious problem in Canada as well. So we need to be mindful of that. It's not just the problem that's in the US. Ezra Levant, for example, has been selling a book titled China Virus, and it's listed as a bestseller on Amazon. And Canada Post has been helping the Epoch Times to distribute publications about the CCP virus to Canadian households, despite multiple complaints from Chinese Canadians. And another recent Canadian example is a Global News report on April 30th, earlier this year, which painted a distorted picture of the Chinese people in Canada and alleged that they helped the Chinese communist government stockpile PPE supplies with ill intention. So this report dehumanized and defamed Chinese Canadians. It misrepresented the efforts of Chinese Canadians buying masks and the PPEs for their families, relatives, and hospitals in China in January and February as sinister acts directed by a foreign government. These people just acted out of humanitarianism. They were just human beings. They were just being humans. Humans capable of feelings and capable of sympathy and compassion. But the Global News refused to see this. Instead, it chose to see them to see them as robots commandeered by the Chinese government. And this report has contributed to further prejudice and anti-Chinese hostility, adding fuel to the ugly trend of scapegoating the Chinese. And evidence for this can be found in hateful anti-Chinese and anti-immigration comments left at the website featuring this report, such as, I quote, "millions of sleeper cells, commies, intern all Chinese nationals, and you must go back now." And there are even comments that accuse anti-racist scholarship and activism as being a smokescreen for defending China, and in order to, it's a attempt to delegitimize anti-racist scholarship and activism as communist. So some commentators have since observed that any Chinese Canadians who had higher education will now be faced with the question, who do you work for? Now remember Derek Sloan's xenophobic outbursts against Dr. Teresa Tam. I quote, "Does she work for Canada or for China?" Right? This is going to happen to many people in Canada. On many occasions, this question will not be asked overtly, but will be asked covertly. Harm will be done, but the evidence of discrimination will be elusive because it's not a fist, because it's not spit. It's not something written on social media. Now, this is one form of systemic racism that is on the rise in Canada, and it's subtle, insidious, and elusive. So I think it's troubling that most of us, when we come to try to understand, come to think of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism, or we think of incidents on the street, but we often do not think about this larger picture, because this large picture is precisely what's at the roots of what happened on the street. I think it's important that that the community and politicians and the governments are take this seriously. Now, the situation on the street, is urgent. It's this, as Olivia earlier has shared some data about. And these what happened on the street are also coincide with the progression of the pandemic as well. For example, in Ottawa, in the last 2 or 3 years, as we entered the second wave of the pandemic, a number of incidents of racist attacks were reported in the media. At one of the major shopping centers, a Chinese man was told by a white male that being forced to wear a mask makes him want to kill all Asians. And in Chinatown, on Somerset Street, a man chased, shouted, and spitted at a Chinese woman. And outside the restaurant in the suburb of Bar Haven, a Chinese Canadian man's car was spitted on repeatedly. And at Kowloon Market in Chinatown, 2 men refusing to wear face masks got abusive and shouted conspiracy theories. So these are happening, and many of us are increasingly uncomfortable when going about everyday life, and it is very tough to talk to our children about these attacks. And I also want to say that there are some unique vulnerabilities and unique harms when it comes to Chinese Canadians and Asian Canadians' experiences with racism. The incidents that we hear about are just really the tiny tip of the iceberg. Nobody really knows how precisely how many such incidents had happened and how bad the problem is, because most Chinese people do not talk about these experiences for a bunch of reasons that I don't have time to get into analyzing. Most would just take it, often not knowing how to make sense of the attacks and what they can do about them in Canada. And some of our most vulnerable community members, the elderly, the relatively new immigrants, have the language barrier. They cannot make out what was shouted at them. They can only tell from the gestures, from the tone, from the facial expressions that something awful was said. They also don't know what support may be there for them. So this is one example of many factors that make them reluctant to speak about experience with this racism and to seek help. So in response to this upsurge of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism, there has been actually quite I would say quite some community organizing. I want to share some observations based on my work in the last few months. Chinese Canadians have, for example, the petitions to counter the racism. There's a petition to press Global News to retract its misleading and hate-stoking reports, for example. And organizations such as Chinese Canadian National Council, Toronto Chapter, has mounted a website to track incidences And there are protests in across the country. For example, there's one in Calgary, I think in May. Given the restriction, the lockdown, it's harder to, if not possible, to organize these rallies and protests as we usually understand them. And so there are efforts to organize online rallies. One that I especially want to mention was organized by a group of Chinese Canadian community groups in Calgary. And it's a cross-country event, and more than 10,000 people attended that one. And another form of community organizing is a lot of, there have been a lot of online discussions, many social media groups. In Chinese language, there are many groups on WeChat who are actually dedicated to understanding racism and to talk about strategizing about possible actions. And in English language, the Facebook group, for example, the subtle Asian traits, hashtag make noise today, and so on. These are also important sites for Chinese and Asian people across the globe to come together to share their experiences with racism that they encountered, and to offer comfort and solidarity. I think in the last few months, we have also seen more workshops, community-based forums offered by community organizations to their clients who mostly are Mandarin speaking, Chinese speaking. And these are important to help people to understand the problem of racism and to know how to respond to them, and then to also become aware of the what tools that we have available, but also limitations of these tools. And then another aspect of community organizing that I think is really important is public education programs. And I want to just spend a few minutes to talk about this, because I had been very involved in developing a series of programs, radio programs actually, for Mandarin-speaking Chinese Canadians. And it's a series on understanding racial discrimination. And some examples from that series include like how to understand the racial hatred amid the COVID pandemic, and then another program on the history of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian discrimination in Canada. People probably would be surprised to hear, but it's not, we cannot assume that people understand racism in the past, in Canadians' past, and its lineage, right? It being lineage to today's racism problems. I think it's important actually to educate people about anti-racist efforts that the Chinese Canadian activists who came before us undertook to fight against the racism. So I think these are all very important community efforts to respond to this rise of racism in the middle of the pandemic. I want to share some thoughts, I guess, in the time that I have left with the audience today. Some reflections about what do we see as what are some of the important things that we should recognize in these efforts, and what are some of the barriers to our community organizing. I want to start with something positive. Um, the first story, I guess, I want to tell about and anti-Asian racism is that it is actually quite a political breakthrough story. Um, because what we see is that faced with increasing violence and hate, some, although not all, Chinese Canadians are telling themselves, literally, we cannot wait anymore. Since March 2020, Chinese Canadians, especially those originated from mainland China since the late 1970s, have engaged in contentious discussions about this. They have become, some of them have become politicized, and some to the extent of taking action for the first time in their life in Canada, to sign petitions, to participate in rallies, and to write the letters to the media and the politicians. So I think it's here we see, even though it might be awkward because they are not very experienced with entering into public discourse about racism, about xenophobia, about identity, about citizenship, but some of them are doing it. So I think that's a really incredibly important to recognize and so inspiring to see. But at the same time, I also want to note some barriers or limitations that we need to overcome in our future work. And one of these barriers is what I call the invisibility of Chinese and Asian Canadians in racial politics. By this, I mean that anti-Asian racism is generally not seen as a problem. Because why? Because of the bias to see Asians as perpetual foreigners. And also because they are often seen as model minority, because of the model minority myth. So these two stereotypes of Asians as perpetual foreigners and as model minority work to reinforce each other. And I think we need to do a lot of work to critically understand and reject both. And it might be more difficult to say, what's wrong with model minority, right? Because actually many people in the community have, that I have too, have often internalized the perceptions of themselves as model minorities, and thus complicit in rendering themselves invisible in racial politics in the country. So I think it's incredibly important to come to critical understanding of the negative impact of model minority. Because it distorts Asians' experiences. It hides Asian fails. And it is also weaponized against indigenous, Black, and other groups in our society. Still, the other thing that I want to mention as a barrier to working together and to organize the community against the racism is the fragmentation, right, of a community. It's a story of multiple crisscrossing fractures among Chinese Canadians. I don't think I will get into details there because there's something I also want to mention, which I think is less talked about. This is the barrier caused by the intersection of class, race, and migration. Now, class is a major barrier in building solidarity. Class matters in many ways. One way it matters is in our depoliticizing neoliberal dominated time is that many of us in the community think that we can overcome racism through getting rich, through having more money. So people with middle-class jobs, comfortable lives, often have a tendency to deny that racism is something that they should care about. and they should work to address. And I would say that class also matters because class matters in two ways. One is that we need to understand the patterns of Asians, Chinese and Asian Canadians class position versus those of indigenous people and blacks. Then the other is the class differences among Chinese Canadians. Now, there are deep inter-minority prejudice and hostility. This is a very sensitive and difficult topic, but this needs to be acknowledged and addressed. We see, I think it's important to acknowledge that the class that does matter in the general lack of connections and the lack of solidarity between Asians, indigenous and the black groups. One recent research project on occupations of South Asian Chinese and black women showed that among different occupations, Chinese South Asians are more likely than blacks to be in occupations requiring a university degree. My hypothesis would be that the same pattern holds when we compare Chinese South Asians with indigenous groups as well. Now, this pattern of intergroup class difference is fundamentally a function of our immigration policy. The needs of Canada's capitalist economy has historically been the driving force of its immigration policy. And the immigration program procured different groups of labor to meet its economic specific needs. So in the late 19th century, indentured and semi-indentured laborers were brought from China to Canada to build the railroad. And but since the 1960s, university-educated immigrants were brought in to staff middle-class, skill-based professional positions in a knowledge economy. The immigration policy that target middle and upper middle class university-educated immigrants since 1970s. Because of that, the Chinese and the South Asians have been two of the largest groups of immigrants who came through those skilled immigrants and the later investment immigration channels. So I think that this is really important to acknowledge, because with this manufactured class patterns, that really prevent a lot of crossing boundaries, a lot of connections from happening. Unless we acknowledge that, we wouldn't really know how to build connections. And just a little bit about class differences among Chinese Canadians. I think that the class cleavages between Chinese Canadian professionals and the working class Chinese Canadians are as pronounced and as difficult to surmount as those between Asian professionals and the working class indigenous people and the blacks. I want to, before I end, I want to just speak a little bit about resistance as the struggle to be self-defining. I think that's a very important aspect of resistance, of activism against the racism. We should work to invent identities for ourselves that challenge negative stereotypes, challenge those racialized and sexist projections upon us, to use Bell Hook's words. One aspect of those stereotypes that I want to speak about concerns what the stereotypes about immigrants from mainland China and their children born in Canada. The Canadian society and even some other Chinese groups need to abandon this very common binary conception of mainland Chinese as either villain accomplices of the Chinese government or victims of the Chinese government. The problem is that mainland Chinese Canadians are slotted into either of these opposite categories of villains or victims. If we do or say anything that does not fit the image of victims of the Chinese government, then we are automatically suspected to be at the other end, to be working for the Chinese government. It's crucial for people to know that we should be understood on our own terms. Our range of experiences, relations, beliefs, and positions deserve to be heard, deserve to be understood and accepted. We do not want to be acceptable to Canadians only when we present ourselves as victims of the Chinese government. We have criticisms of the Chinese government, but we also have complex views as opposed to a single view. So I think it's in fighting against racism, it means fighting against, in part, against the stereotypes, and to give people the space to define themselves, to really accept their self-definition is crucial. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaobei, for your very interesting. And as I've heard you before, I knew it was going to be a complex and interesting talk, and I appreciate it. I think I'll go straight into questions because there's a number and we have a limited time. And the first one that I'm seeing is from Stephen. And Xiaobei, I believe you've already addressed this. I'll read it out loud. It says, how does community organizing against anti-Chinese racism become more difficult due to the fracture in the Chinese community, such as a different stance on politics and issues? And maybe I'll start asking Olivia your response to this, Olivia, because we heard some of this in Xiaobei's talk.
The fraction always exists because in any community, it doesn't matter because everybody has different political points of views. They may come from different parts, whether they're Hong Kong, mainland China, Taiwan. You know, there is one common thing. The skin is not white. And if there's racism, people that hurl insults or racist graffiti wouldn't care where you're coming from. So I don't believe that it's more difficult in a way because racism unites us. Yes, there's different political views, but the interesting thing is that people that have different political views, they are Canadians. Ultimately, they are here and they understand the need of saying no to racism. Now, the approach might be totally different. Approach on what a Mandarin mainland Chinese in how you approach them in dealing with racism, because their narrative, their story is different than someone that are coming from Hong Kong, that are someone that are born in Canada, or someone coming from Taiwan, or someone from Vietnam. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, your hair is still black, right? Or white, you know, unless you dye it. So, which I do. And so, I do hope that the Chinese National Council for Social Justice, for example, or Alan Lee's team, ProTech, and other groups. In Calgary, we have Teresa Wupa's team. There are teams all across Canada that it doesn't matter where you're from, that we say no to any Chinese racism.
Thank you, Olivia. Did you have any more that you wanted to add to this, Xiaobei?
I think, yes, I do. I think Olivia is right that in the end of the day, racism is racism. It doesn't distinguish whether you're Hong Kong Chinese or mainland Chinese, etc. I think that's really important to keep in mind. I guess what I see is that in practice, in reality, because we come from different migration routes, right? A different time, different temporal dimension, but also different routes. We came to this country through different paths, and there are the different political inclinations that are associated with that, the different dialects of Chinese language and even cultural practices. So the community, like even without talking about anti-racism, the communities tend to be doing their own thing. So, but when it comes to talk about how to work together, how to band together to do concrete things to fight racism, the problem is that we didn't have much connections, relationship, and not much trust, right? In each other. So I think these are things that we should acknowledge and should not let them stop us from working together. I think if we have that commitment to make connections, to understanding each other, to working together, we can make things happen. It may take some time, but it will happen. In the end, we are discriminated in the same way. So we should work together against the problem.
I do want to say that Andy Shi from CPAC, which is the mainland Chinese group, Chinese Professional Association, is very much part of the team that are doing work in the community on anti-Asian racism. I do want to be very clear what the Chinese government, because I see another question here, that what's happening in mainland China, what the Chinese government do in China, or their position as it relates to the two Michaels, that's the Chinese government. That should not have any impact on Chinese Canadians. It's just like, the Japanese Canadians being blamed when Japan invaded Pearl Harbor, for example, right? So I think it's really important, it's incumbent to all of us to say, wait, hang on. If you don't agree with the policy of the Chinese government, you are entitled to that. I do not agree with that policy. I am very much part of the democracy team in Hong Kong and work hard to support them. But that does not have anything to do with Chinese Canadians being discriminated. So let us be very clear to separate government versus people in China, people in Hong Kong, and people in Canada, and not get them confused and mixed up. Because the minute we do that, we walk into the trap that over and over again, so people become responsible for the government's policy. Let's not do that kind of stereotyping.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for your answers. We'll move on. There's quite a few. We're getting a nice lively chat. An interesting question around intersectionality. A lot of discrimination, racism seems to also intersect with the notion of ageism, where Asian older adults are specifically being targeted. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Maybe Xiaobei first this time.
Sure. Yes, I think this is one aspect of the intersectionality that I try to allude to, which is it's a particular dimension of the vulnerability I think, faced by many Chinese Canadians. Elderly Chinese Canadians, many of them are very isolated because of lack of support for them in the Chinese language. So, as I said earlier, many of them, because of the language barrier, would not even understand what was shouted at them and what was said with them, and they also don't they also have very limited understanding about where to go to get help. So, and even if they wanted to report an incident to the police, there's very limited support for them to help them to do that as well. And mind you, I mean, remember that the police is actually plays a very limited role in racism, right? Racism has many forms, has many dimensions. The kind of hate crime that the police look into is the threshold is quite high. It's not sufficient to address a lot of racism that people experience in their everyday life. So I think with the elderly, it's especially acute that the difficulties the experience as a result of language and as a result of lack of support, social support. And that's something that when we think about how to fight racism, building community agencies capacity to support is really key.
Can, bullies pick on the most vulnerable. If you're older, you don't walk as straight, right? And if you are poorer, you may not have you often end up having to take the bus. You're up in the public more, you're not in the car. You're more exposed to racists. If you work in a grocery store, because that's what your job is, you have higher chance of confronting racists that wouldn't wear a mask walking in, right? So, and we saw that happening a few times in different grocery stores. So it's not just the community that needs it. We can do all the education, give all the information, and give all the websites and all of that. It's not going to work, period. Of the 34 years I've done education on anti-racist education, both in high schools, in elementary schools, seniors, the only thing that would work is for the people themselves that are subject to it to have the confidence and the wherewithal and the people that are surrounding them to say no. Okay, now that's easier said than done. For people like myself or Ken, I think it's easier for people that are that have a certain income, certain background. I learned karate when I was a kid, so yeah, just come anywhere near me, just watch out. I have that kind of, because I grew up downtown Toronto. Okay, I can handle it. So don't mess with me. But a lot of folks that are confronting that already have multiple disadvantage in some ways. So I think it's really important for the community to say that let us do some mentorship or role playing, some training that can booster up people's comfort level to call out racists or to support people that are witnessing some kind of, or to call out the employer, call out the customer to say, no, this is not acceptable, we're not backing down. A lot of that is individual training. And of course, information where you turn to, and where you turn to is the information available in different language, different dialect. All of that is really important, because you know what, we can do a lot of those things, but if you're not going to be able to reach those frontline workers working in grocery stores and restaurants that are doing takeout, right? So it's getting to the people that are most subjected to the racism that is most important.
I'm going to move on to the next question. Thank you both. Until recently, this is from Lionel Lee. Until recently, I worked for the largest AAPI civil rights org in the US. So I've been to many such talks, including one by, I don't have my glasses on, Kathrik Ramakrishnan. But Dr. Chen's point about anti-Asian racism predating COVID and being tied with the scapegoating of China due to current fraught nation-to-nation relationship. This point is almost always elided. Why do you think this aspect of the issue isn't widely discussed? Do you want to lead that question, Xiaobei?
Yeah, thank you for this a great question. I think 2 points come to my mind. One is that the discourse of blaming Chinese has just become so natural, right? It has been normalized. So when people hear it, they don't question it. They don't say, well, wait a minute, there's something, not quite here. That the socio-economic situation, the housing situation in Vancouver, maybe there's a larger picture there. Maybe it's not just because of rich Chinese immigrants coming to buy up houses. I think, maybe there's something to do with the policy. Maybe it's something to do with investors from other places as well. So I think it's that, because the racism was deep-seated. So when blaming the socioeconomic problems on the Chinese, it was just seen as, yeah, that makes sense, right? Rather than being questioned. And I think the other thing, though, that I want to say is that we also have internalized what I said earlier, the model minority-ness. Actually, at the beginning of the COVID, of the pandemic, when racism already started to really happening at an alarmingly rate, what I see is that many Chinese Canadians still don't want to see that as a problem, or do not want to see that as a systemic problem. I think it's because they really accept that, come to see themselves as model minorities, that they somehow see racism as other people's problems. So that's something that's difficult to talk about, but I think is something that is absolutely essential to understand. Otherwise, it's going to be a major barrier in addressing anti-Asian racism.
Ken, every time that Donald Trump, when I was watching him debating Biden, I don't know, so several times, every time he mentioned China, we had a drinking game. We had a bingo card going. And you know what? Oh my God. Thank God I stopped drinking after a while, because I would pass out. It was like scapegoating. China, there's China. Like, oh my God, right? It's relentless. And so I wonder why. But all of this comes from scapegoating. It's a very, very natural, like some people do it a lot more than they do, like, and we like to, and human nature, scapegoat. And when you're economically insecure, which is hard to see. Classism is hard to see. Race, class, gender, right? And all, like, you can, it's easier to see race and gender. It's hard to see class. So there are people, now I'm not saying that people that have a lot of money do not scapegoat, but they're already very privileged. So people that are economically insecure or insecure because of their sexual identity or because they're male, they're feeling, you know, these uppity women and blah, 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 like, you know, oh, they need to blame somebody, right? So scapegoating is what's happening, and we need to call it out like it is and say to the folks, you know, let's work with you to not necessarily just contradict, because contradiction and having different opinions, arguing over facts won't work, but really coming to the experience to say, wait a second, you're experiencing real trauma because you're making $14 an hour, you can't make ends meet, or you're about to lose your home, you're feeling really insecure, you're feeling desperate. This kind of desperation, let us understand who is at fault, who has the power to make the change, which is ultimately government, right? The people that collect our taxes. And if we could do more of that to get the people that are feeling insecure for various reasons, to then have them organize in a way to connect with them, listening to their desire and their experience, and move them out of their racial biases into a place that should be directed to, wait a second, how come there's all these billionaires, and how come we live in the richest country, one of the richest country in the world, and yet the people are not having fresh water and etc., right? So I think that's really important for us to do. And in order to do that, we need to connect and align ourselves with BIPOC people of color, Black and Indigenous. And the W5 movement that I talked about, one of the first speech that Chuck Kwan did, was the original person that the core team that put together the anti-W5 canvas giveaway campaign, was Chuck Kwan. His first speech was in the funeral of Albert Johnson, who was shot dead. He was Black man shot dead by police. And the connection between the Chinese Canadian and the Black community at the time was there, and he got a standing ovation. It was because that the discrimination, that it is not just Asian, because Asians should not just see they are the only ones, Black and Indigenous that are, you know, in many ways suffering even more. So I think that connection is critical, is important. It'll lift us out of the, oh, well, you know, you're from China and Hong Kong, blah, blah, blah. No, wait a second. Let's call it what it is, and let's stop people from scapegoating.
I am conscious that we've already come to time. It's such a rich discussion, and you're both so articulate, if I might, that we've come to time so quickly. I would like to, and unfortunately there's some questions, you know, stranded in chat, as happens. But I'd like to give the last few minutes to each of you, if there's anything out of this discussion or some final comments you would like to give us. How about Olivia? You go first.
I saw an interesting question. Confucius' value seems to be at odds with what it means to organize in a Western context. Yes and no, because ultimately it is about respect and putting others before you. And I think that journey of finding a different narrative, different common good, I believe that when we come together, having going through a journey for sense of belonging and fighting for the common good, that's ultimately the only way we can get to a place where there's more equality and less racism. And we do that by organizing locally and giving people voice, giving people power, and which is what I do over at changeleaders.ca. And I just want to end to invite folks that if they're free tonight, between 6 to 8, 6 to 7:30, we're celebrating our 4th anniversary. Come and celebrate these award winners that have transformed their own lives and the lives of the community around them. So check me out at changeleaders.ca.
Great. Ever the community organizer, Olivia.
Yeah, can't help it. It's in the DNA. Sorry.
So Xiaobei, you get the final word. What would you like?
Well, thank you. I was actually happened to be looking at the same question, and I want to say that I think the observation is right on that in Confucianism. I mean, I grew up in a context where Confucianism was also repudiated in China, but still, I think those cultural influences in terms of to even just the speaking, right? To always respect the hierarchy and do not speak out of order, and so on. I think yes, those things are at to some extent a lot at odds with how to organize and how to act, how to advocate for yourself and self as community itself in a Western context. And it's because of that I feel there is a lot of work that we actually need to do in the community about how to participate effectively in a democratic context. And but at the same time, I'm just by personality, I'm not I'm more interested in mixing things and messy pictures and so on. So I'm sure it would be interesting to think about some notions that might be useful from Confucianism and in my more recent exploration in Buddhist thought that can help us think about racism and think about anti-racism work as well. So I think, for example, the Buddhists thought about we're all interrelated, right? So that I find that actually are very helpful for me to think about what it means to build solidarity. It's for me, it's not just about strengthening the us versus them, right? Rather, it's also about in addition to strengthening us, it's also about how to dissolve otherness, how to see the interconnections that we have with each other, how not to fall into binary thinking about victims versus perpetrators and so on. So I think I'll end with those thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you. We've run over at this point. A very engaging session that reminds us of the urgency of dealing with anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism. And thank you for your philosophical, community-based, and personal engagement. This will be recorded and it will be available up on the Jack Layton YouTube channel, so you can tell people who have missed it. And feel free to let us know at Layton Chair any further comments you have about this session. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to Xiaobei and Olivia. Bye now.